This will be a short presentation about how to program on the Quorum platform. First of all, I'd like to say that most, if not all, enterprise and business applications will benefit from using the Quorum platform because it provides a couple of essential features that are absent from the baseline web platform, and that only Quorum provides. So whether you are developing a software as a service offering, or if you're developing internal applications or integrations across all these, you can benefit from using Quorum. So let's go to the meat of the presentation. So Quorum provides a second browser runtime that complements JavaScript, and it is available as a browser extension right now. So here is the meat of the presentation. I have prepared a template for Quorum APIs and applications. Let's quickly launch that. Okay, so we can see here that we have the Quorum API here on this website has a home endpoint, which is the main application entry endpoint. And then there is a view item endpoint. So this is a very simple application with two endpoints basically. One, the home endpoint that runs indefinitely, and so that's the application endpoint. And then a more conventional endpoint, API endpoint, let's say, in the sense that it returns a result to its caller. So let's look at the code, how this is programmed. So we have the versioned API with a V1 version available right now, and it has two endpoints. So these are the paths that will be called by the API caller, and then we have a localization phase. For example, when the home endpoint is called, here we have application logic that decides which language the user corresponds to the user best, and redirects to a localized version of the endpoint. So here it is. Okay, so a couple of essential points to make here. The Quorum platform has a new way of interlinking, a new linking mechanism, because what the baseline web platform provides is not enough. So the anchor element and so on are not enough for doing application integrations and so on. So this is my version of this is the Quorum's version of linking between applications. So instead of a simple URL, a link consists of a script basically. It isn't just a URL, but a script that says which calls to perform, and plus what to do when the calls returns a result. For example, here we have an instruction that says call the view item endpoint, and then return to the same URL that has called the endpoint. So this is the new linking mechanism that applications need, and the basic web platform doesn't provide. And Quorum fixes that. So let's look at something else. View item. So this is the calling side of things. Here we have a call, and so let's see now how the returning side of things works. So the home endpoint has called a view item endpoint. So how does the view item endpoint return a result? So again, that's also a script. So I have the script format that I have developed for Quorum works both for calling API endpoints and returning from calls. So here we have a return instruction. The script basically just returns some data. That's as simple as that. So in this example, I don't have user authentication, but how would an API that has to authenticate the end user would work in this environment? It's very simple. So the caller doesn't concern himself with authenticating the user. It is the endpoints themselves who decide whether to authenticate the end user or not, and if they have to authenticate, then that happens behind the scenes without the caller being aware of everything that is going on. So one possible way of implementing user authentication would be to have for each API a private API, a second private API that is whose concern is user authentication. So in this example, we have, for example, a program, a project management application, let's say, which calls an HR application for choosing the participants of a project, let's say. So one possible scenario is that each API has its own accompanying private user authentication API, or this user authentication API could be totally independent and directly called by the public APIs, or this central user authentication API can be called behind the scenes from the individual private authentication APIs. So you have a great deal of latitude and freedom in terms of programming. Note here is that in such a scenario where a project management application has to call an HR application behind the scenes on the server side, let's say, through a REST call, let's say, then this kind of scenarios would be impossible with REST. And why? Because, for example, the HR API wouldn't have direct access to the end user. So in this case, how to authenticate the end user? It is impossible with REST and other web APIs, but it is possible and very easy with Quorum. In fact, Quorum is the easiest API platform to program with. If you want to do integrations, if you want to do API calls, REST is much more difficult because everything happens on the server side. You have to master the server side of programming. Here we have the only skills that are required are basic web development skills, and that's enough. So, so here I've mentioned that it is possible to define private APIs. For example, how do you ensure that the API remains private, for example, or individual endpoints in a public API remain private? So this is very simple because each API call receives, contains in the HTTP request a referrer, so which points to the API caller. So it's very easy for an endpoint to decide whether to authorize the call or not. That could be because the endpoint should be private or reserved or to a well-defined couple of callers, or it could be also be the case that the API is a paid service, and the API has to verify that the URL that calls the API has paid for using the service. So this type of whitelisting is very easy. So there are a couple of limitations currently, mainly because the browser extension specifications themselves have limitations. For example, browser extensions cannot disable the tab history, and this is the only reason actually why I have to impose a couple of restrictions that are geared towards preventing new entries to be added to tab histories. All right. So basically, that mandates that redirections should use a replace method. So a regular hyperlink would be uncalled for here. This would be incorrect in the quorum world, at least the way with the way that the browser extensions work. But these restrictions could be lifted further down the line, depending on the willingness of the browser implementers. So this would be scratched and would be replaced with this kind of buttons. And also web forms. Web forms would typically generate a post request, and with a post request you have to a new entry is automatically added to the browser's tab history. So this is a no-go. Instead, a fetch call should be is what I'm recommending instead of doing a regular form action. These are some of the restrictions that I currently have. Also noteworthy is the fact that API calls do not generate a post request or anything like that. In the quorum world, everything is a GET request, and when a call is made and it has, for example, arguments, call arguments like that, even if in that case, all these argument passing, etc., happens inside the browser in a call stack that is attached to the browser tab. So no network traffic is generated when you do a call is made. So you have the same configuration with GoTo. GoTo is also a GET request. So just one general comment here. You might have noticed that the kind of user flows that Quorum enables reminds maybe most of you of the OAuth user authorization flow. Here we have a website who is contacting an authorization server. So the user is redirected to the authorization server and then redirected back. So this is exactly the kind of thing that Quorum also enables, except that Quorum is much more general purpose than that. And in fact, I can very well imagine a Quorum flavored OAuth authorization flow where the whole thing would be a regular call would be initiated with a Quorum script. One advantage would be that redirect URI would no longer be necessary, for example, because the script itself defines what happens when the call returns. So Quorum has a more general version of the OAuth user flow, if you will, and this is the type of thing that can that is enabled with Quorum. If you have any comments and feedback, they're welcome. Goodbye for now.